Well, hello everybody. Welcome to this latest Rackspace webcast. The webcast I'll be talking about today was Office Web Applications 2013 and what is new. Basically, we're just going to be going over what changed in Office Web Applications 2013, what you should be looking out for. We'll go through a demo install. Hopefully that'll go correctly. We're kind of playing with fire here. Unfortunately, as all timing goes, the demo servers I was working on last night, trying to tweak them, getting ready for this presentation, of course, crashed and burned on me. So I'm having to work here kind of on the wire, and we'll see how it goes. And if nothing else, this will turn into a troubleshooting session, and then we'll get even more out of it. All right, well, let's get into it. Like I said, I'm Javier Barrera. This is me. As my website, my email address, my Twitter handle, all the prerequisite things that we do in SharePoint land. Of course, this broadcast will be recorded, so you can see it later. I know you want to show it to your friends and family at a later date, maybe Christmas, something like that, and gift it. Feel free. Of course, just let me know. So, javierbarrera.com, javier.barrera@rackspace.com is my email here at work. My Twitter handle is JTBarrera, which is primarily I use just for SharePoint stuff and work-related stuff and anything I might be messing around with at the moment. I am a SharePoint engineer here at Rackspace. I have been working in IT, enterprise-level IT, for approximately 12 plus years. I, of course, have the alphabet soup credentials if you want to know them. I have done here at Rackspace, we host servers, we host installation farms, we install SharePoint farms. So I have done quite a number of SharePoint installations, and that number keeps on going up month by month. We also do, small ones, and we do big ones. So we also do the large traffic sites as well too. So as the new version came out, we're of course asked to look at it and start implementing it as soon as possible. And so we have. So I got quite familiar with this particular piece of the puzzle. So here's what we'll be talking today. We'll be talking about a look at the past, what Office Web Applications meant to us previously, and how it was kind of architectured. I'll assume you're somewhat familiar with that, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. We'll look at what's new, how the new Office Web Applications for 2013 has changed, and what's great, and the latest things, and things you should be aware of, and things you should be telling your coworkers how great it is. And we'll kind of go, like I said, into the demo. We'll do a quick install. The Office Web Applications is dramatically different as far as the install is concerned, and I'll be pointing that out as I go along. And so we'll see that, and we'll see how it goes, and hopefully we've got our fingers crossed. Everything should go as planned. So the Office Web Applications 2010 architecture, as I'm sure you're familiar with, looks something like this. You had a bunch of users. Your SharePoint farm might have been one server. It might have been 20 servers. But basically, you could install Office Web Application, the components of that, and run it on one server in your farm, or run it on multiple servers in your farm for redundancy. And SharePoint was the only entity in the Microsoft family that could really leverage the ability, of what Office Web Applications do. Unfortunately, poor Exchange and poor Link, didn't even know about it, and so they were the ones left out of that particular family. So this is what I'm sure we're all used to seeing. So what do we have in Office Web Applications 2013? We couldn't run Office Web Applications in a domain controller. It was tightly integrated into SharePoint 2010, which in and of itself caused its own problems. If you tried to, do any kind of modifications, that usually caused you some unintended downtime for any kind of patching, if you want to remove it, to install it, anything of that nature, just because of the way it was so tightly integrated with SharePoint, would cause you major headaches and something that you would need to take the farm down. So it's something in very large farms, which is very, very tough to do in large farms that demanded, close to as 99999 as possible. There was a lot of confusion. I saw wrapped around the whole Excel web app and Excel services, what does what, and who does what, and how that works out. And it was not an easy thing to explain to somebody. I'm not even quite sure conceptually. I have it in my head, but it's kind of tough to explain to somebody what the exact differences are. As I previously noted, you can install Office Web Application onto one or all your SharePoint web front-end servers in your farm, depending on how heavily you used it, where you wanted to have it, if you have the application servers or things of that nature. And it was leveraged as a SharePoint feature, which means you could turn it off and on per site collection, and if you needed to do that for whatever reason. Typically, it wasn't practical because if you of the way it was licensed, then there would have to be really good reasons as to why you would do that. And of course, one of the odd things about it was you had to have special database permission requirements. This typically happened if you install SharePoint in the least privileged access model. The particular service application that runs Office Web Applications and that particular pool and that particular ID would need to have permissions into the content databases of which it was trying to open. And even when you created new content databases, that particular permission for that particular web application would not be assigned automatically. So it's something you would have to do on a, know about it and kind of keep in back of your mind as you're spinning up content databases. In small farms, not a big deal. You don't normally typically, rack up, a lot of content databases. You don't worry about that. You sign it once, you're done, and you forget about it. In larger farms, it can become somewhat problematic when you're spinning up, 3 or 4 content databases a day, and your farm's growing by leaps and bounds. Something just, one of them little gotchas that you keep in mind, right? So some of the problems that we talked about, like I said, we'll just go talk about this. It added extra load wherever it was installed. If it was used quite heavily, you would see a dramatic performance drop, just like any other service application. It had limited browser support. Basically, if you weren't in IE, you were pretty much out of luck. It did not like Chrome. It didn't like Firefox. It didn't like Safari. Well, to some extent, it treated them like long-lost cousins. It would kind of acknowledge them and give them somewhat limited support, but you couldn't get the true power unless you were actually using Internet Explorer. It wanted Internet Explorer, basically. You had limited document editing capabilities. Yes, you could open document. Yes, you could change words and do some real basic stuff, but that was about the extent of it. So you really couldn't do anything more than that. Back when Office 2010 came out, the concept of having tablets and smartphones and touch support for all this wasn't even a thought, at least in my eye anyway. Oh, I want to run Office Web Applications. Should I run it for my tablet, for my smartphone? Can I do that? When we're used to opening up Office, SharePoint 2010 and that ugly, ugly mobile site, what hope could we have ever had to actually open up any type of documents and edit those documents from our small phone? So, and of course, the somewhat complex patching cycle, you have to take that into account whenever you're trying to upgrade it. Different patches than your normal cumulative updates or service packs. So something to keep in mind. Not as ugly as, let's say, Project 2010 and how that was integrated, but definitely is something to keep an eye on, especially if you had language packs. Language packs can somewhat become problematic. I've had several customers think that they needed to install every single language, and that causes a lot of problems. So we try to minimize that as much as possible. And if you're not speaking, let's say, Swahili, or nobody in SharePoint line, your SharePoint line uses Swahili, you probably shouldn't be installing it, right? So just something to keep in mind, some of the problems that we're running into and things that we should be aware of. All right. So, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask, and let me know, so we can answer those along the way. I'd like to have this more as a conversation, answering questions as we go along. So feel free. All right. Let's see. So some of the advantages Office Web Application 2013 offers. Now, this is, I will say, it has been RTM'd, released to manufacturers, so it's officially out. There's admittedly a little bit of rough edges around it, and it's still a little bit of just a couple of things you should keep in mind, and I'll point those out as we go along. But it's a really fantastic product. It definitely took a different direction in how it handles things, and greatly expanded its capabilities. Of course, saying all that means that it occupies a lot of hardware, and you have some definite hardware restrictions and requirements on this, and we'll point that as well too. So, in everything as Microsoft would have it, Microsoft's latest and greatest never runs on less hardware. It always runs on more hardware and bigger RAMs and bigger hard disks. So it's just the way it goes, and something, definitely to mitigate and keep track of, but just know about, right, when you're going from this version to another version. I will say, and this has been asked of me a couple times, can we, somehow use, are they cross-compatible? Is 2013 and 2010 OWA cross-compatible with either one of them? And the answer to that is no. And that, you'll see why, because of the architecture of 2013 and how it's built out, right? All right. So some of the real big things that I really like about Office Web Applications, easy upgrades without any downtime. That's right. You can upgrade Office Web Application and its associated language packs, if you have any, without causing any downtime to the SharePoint farm. Now, as a matter of fact, the downtime to the Office Web Applications is somewhat fairly minimal as well too. It takes you as long as it takes you to run 2 PowerShell commands. That's your extent of your downtime, and we'll talk about that going a little bit. And that reminds me, as in all things 2013, this is very PowerShell heavy. There are very few things in Office Web Application, the new one, that you can do through the GUI. As a matter of fact, I can't think of anything for administration purposes. It does not have a GUI web front end. Everything is done via PowerShell. Don't let that scare you. There are a ton of resources on the internet already out there, including my own, as I was experimenting and playing with it and drastically failing at it more than once, to my own embarrassment. But Microsoft has some excellent articles as well too you could follow. That would be the primary one. But as anything else, please do this in your development environment before you do it in your production environment, right? Just makes sense. All right. So the next thing is scaling without SharePoint impact, meaning that, in 2010 we talked about, well, if we used Office Web Applications a lot, if we're doing a lot of converting, if we're doing a lot of editing, if we're doing a lot of showing, that would heavily impact our SharePoint web front ends. In this model, SharePoint is not impacted at all. Even if our users are grinding those servers to death, SharePoint doesn't care. SharePoint is not affected. Now, I will say that as an administrator, and or playground server, it's something to keep in mind that if Office Web Applications is not performing up to task, users will interpret that as being SharePoint. So while your SharePoint farm may be perfectly fine running under its load, if Office Web Applications is not tuned correctly and it slows down, the interpretation of that is that SharePoint is bad. SharePoint is not working. So there's something broken in SharePoint. So just keep that in mind as you go through this. You'll see that often. I've seen a lot of requests to that, requests coming into my team saying, hey, our SharePoint is working really slow, and it actually turned out to be Office Web Applications. So after spending a day, in my particular case, after spending a day looking for a problem with SharePoint, I could not find anything of a significant nature. There's always something in SharePoint though, right? We just went back and said, hey, what exactly are you doing? What exactly are you talking about? And, well, when I open up this preview window, the preview never stops or never comes up and says, sorry, can't display this. I was like, oh, okay, that's something else totally different. So part of the model, moving on from that story, part of the capabilities that you're going to get to do with Office Web Applications 2013 is it expanded it to so that Exchange, link, file shares, and even some custom sources that you're able to write can now leverage the power of Office Web Applications, meaning that your Exchange users can now open the Word documents. Not only open, we were used to seeing, in the new Office version, we're used to be able to open the documents, but can you imagine now opening and editing those documents, or opening and, creating new documents, or, creating PowerPoint slides, modifying PowerPoint slides right from the browser, or right from the whatever client you're using that leverages Exchange, or even link. Imagine somebody sends you a link file, and now you can, oh, look at my presentation, proof it, edit it, make any changes needed. You can do it right from the browser. If you're comfort of your own home, right from the browser. And, an extension of that is now we can do that with file shares. It doesn't even necessarily need to be on Exchange or a link. If you just send them the link to a file share, Office Web Applications can leverage its power and open up that particular document from a regular file share. Of course, it has to be Windows file share with all the Windows stuff on it. And you can open and edit it there. So some pretty cool stuff. And now you can, of course, create files within a browser, which I had never thought of before in 2010. Honestly, I was like, oh, really? I just never occurred to me that I would want to do that. Pretty cool when you think about it. Some nice functionality there. And it has much better cross-browser compatibility, meaning and there's a reason why, right? Meaning it works great in not only Internet Explorer, our friend Internet Explorer, or your hated enemy, Internet Explorer, depending on whichever view you take, but actually works great in Firefox, Chrome, and Safari as well too. Your major web browsers. Now, if you want to say, well, it doesn't work with Nautilus and it doesn't work with just Opera, for instance, I would tell you, well, it's greater, but it's not perfect, right? So that's one thing to keep in mind. As a side note to that, while it is capable of displaying information seamlessly across these different major browser platforms, the one thing to keep in mind is that you're still subject to that particular browser's little idiosyncrasies. So let's say, for instance, one of the problems I was having was that Internet Explorer was you could have Office Web Applications running with a secure certificate, an SSL cert, and Internet Explorer was fine with the way it was handling the chain. The company had their own certificate authority, internal certificate authority, and Internet Explorer was perfectly fine. Firefox and Chrome did not want to display the information at all because it did not like internal certificates. They didn't know how to play well with them. They didn't know how to play well in that infrastructure. So, with some of the things to watch out for, it isn't so much in the fact that it's Office Web Application, rather it's that particular idiosyncrasy with the browser, right? Just something to keep in mind as well, too. And there's really not anything you can do within Office Web Applications to change that behavior because it's all browser behavior in and of itself. All right, I think we've been too long on this slide. So basically, this is just a pretty picture of what I was talking about. Now, Office Web Applications can be used everywhere. The important thing to note here is that it's a separate farm. There are separate servers. That's the big change here. Sure, Office Web Application no longer sits with 2013. It's now moved into its own house and now services other avenues, and it helps everybody else out. But the thing to think about here is, while it does sit on its own, that means you have to have extra servers. So what you could previously accomplish all in one on one SharePoint server, now you have to do with two servers. So give and take, as with anything like Microsoft I previously mentioned, you're going to be spending some money. It doesn't have to be the biggest piece of software, it's just something appropriately sized, right? It could be a virtual machine. You're probably better off doing virtual. I do a ton of virtual installations here, right? So Now, the other question is, and this is the other problem, is, as we put load on top of the server, can we scale? And the answer is yes, and very easily. Once you set up an Office Web Application farm, that's the first server, you can very easily add Office Web Application servers to that farm. You go from a server to a farm to Office Web Application farm, multiple servers within the farm. It all handles its own internal load balancing, much like SharePoint does. Now I have a question. What is my question? Do I have a question? So let me stop here. I think I have a question. Oh, I am going too far. Oops, give me a second here. Are PDFs included in Office Web Applications? No. SharePoint 2013 can index PDFs out of the box, but Office Web Applications will not display them. That's, again, a browser dependency. It leverages the PDF viewer from the browser. And you definitely cannot edit or create PDFs from inside Office Web Applications. Although that would be pretty cool. I would assume some third-party hard-working web application company sees this hole, and they will probably fill it. I have not seen any companies do that quite yet, so we'll see how that goes. So does this mean Office Web Applications 2013 no longer needs SharePoint to run? Yes, that is correct. It does not need SharePoint to run at all, so it can run independent. Let's say you have Exchange and you want to give this capability to Exchange and just Exchange, you can do that, even without SharePoint. All right. So, all right. Let's see here. Good. All right. So, as we backward like this picture, we see here we have multiple servers in this Office Web Application farm. Load balancing between those farms is taken care of internally. It is encouraged that you can actually load balance these, or put a network load balancer in front of them. Typically, we're talking about F5s, or not F5s, Cisco CSS, F5s, things of that nature. Things that hardware load balancers can sit in front of these, handle much more efficiently. So definitely something as you're scaling up and ramping up your much larger farms that you can definitely work with and have leverage over. All right. So some new terms, with anything new, there are new terms in 2013 we're going to have to learn, right? So the first one and the most important one is WAPI. WAPI is not your cousin's dog. It is short for Web Application Open Platform Interface. And that took me a while to figure that one out. I actually have to go look for that when I was first talking about WAPI all over the place, and Microsoft didn't bother explaining what it was till later. So what WAPI is that interface, and that's, again, why we talk about the interface, because it's a standardized interface that we can, once we know what that is, you developers out there can probably customize code against it and run code against it. That gives you that customized portion of it. That's a little bit above me. So I'm not really a developer, although I am at all sometimes with developers, sometimes I'm not. As an administrator, we have that kind of back and forth. So WAPI provides the link between SharePoint farm and an OWA farm, or it also provides the link between the OWA farm and the Exchange farm, or the link farm, or the link service. WAPI is kind of that interface between those two. Now there's two components to the WAPI, and this is kind of counterintuitive. So when you think about this, the WAPI app is the Office Web Application farm. The actual OWA farm is the app. The host is the farm that's taking advantage of the WAPI app, right? You would think that's backwards, counterintuitive to me. I think the best way I've figured it out in my head, anyway, if this makes any sense, is to think of it from the user perspective. Uh, the user leverages the host, the SharePoint host, and it uses the capabilities of the app, the SharePoint Web Applications app, right? Uh, so thinking it from the user perspective and coming in from that direction kind of makes it a little bit more sense. Kind of got backwards there a little bit. So I think I have another question. Do I have another question here? Do you have the latest version of SharePoint and SQL Server? Will it work off of previous versions? Yes, I do have the latest version, and yes, it does run on the latest version. If you can figure out Windows Server 2012, I'm still kind of getting used to it myself. Will it work off previous versions? The answer is yes, to some degree. They have to be upgraded, and we'll see that in the hardware requirements and the software requirements as well too. And as I posted up to my blog, I'll definitely define what those are, and so you can get a firm grasp of that. But you don't necessarily need to have the biggest and baddest software. It can be quite expensive. To install a Office Web Application farm, it's more about the hardware that's involved. It's not not so much the software. Again, it has to be a SharePoint 2013 farm or an Exchange 2013 or a Link 2013. It will not work with previous versions. Okay. So now that we can have multiple OWA servers in an OWA farm, we can actually dedicate a role to particular servers and or as front-end servers, Excel servers, or back-end servers, or PowerPoint servers. So if you find that you're working for a financial company, let's say as an example, I had this particular example happen where they used Excel more and above than anything else. That they just spun up. We created Excel backend servers that just did nothing but service Excel web applications. And that helped out a lot, since they weren't hardly ever doing anything else. We had one server that did everything else, played all the other roles except for Excel, and we had multiple Excel servers doing that. So just something to keep in mind. Not very typical, even in larger farms. I generally don't see that. It's usually for dedicated, dedicated companies that are using it for dedicated reasons, i.e. the financial firm, right, which loves Excel. Okay, so now the concept of the master machine. This is one of those things that you just have to keep in mind. When you create your first server, your first Office Web Application server, that particular server is termed the master machine. Basically, it is the controlling unit of the farm. It carries a special property within itself that maps out the rest of the servers within your farm. So when you add in additional servers, basically the master machine takes account of those additional servers and keeps track of what servers are there. Now, while that sounds like a single point of failure, not so much, because basically they're all talking to each other. They're all basically rechecking each other, making sure we have a master machine in place. If it finds that the master machine has disappeared, it will try its best to recreate a new. It'll basically say, "Oh, okay, my master machine is missing. I'm going to go create my own master file, and I'm going to be the master machine." Basically they figured out that. Don't know the exact way that works, but I have seen it work before. If you take out the master machine, the first server, like let's say you're doing a patching cycle, it will gracefully hand off the master machine duties to any of the other servers that are still left in that farm. So it takes care of that automatically for you. Master machine is not something that you should really be worried about. It handles it pretty well. Just one of those weird things of how it handles stuff and how it keeps track of stuff. I thought it was important to point out because it shows exactly, what's happening and how it points stuff out. So let's go on to the next one here. So when we talk about, how simple or how complex can it be, and yes, please, you see my very pretty visiographic skills here. It's the user basically interfacing with SharePoint, and SharePoint is basically leveraging the OWA server. Now, again, that's the SharePoint server is the WAPI host, right? And it's leveraging the application, the OWA WAPI app. Okay. Now it can get obviously a lot more complicated. In this example here, we have multiple SharePoint web front ends. We have a state server. That's a role that pretty much acts like, pretty much keeps track of who's talking to what. And you can have multiple dedicated, and you can have them redundant, and you can have them load balanced, and you can have any number of configurations. A little bit beyond what we're talking about here, but it's certainly capable. All right. Okay, let's talk about the requirements. Office 2013 requirements. At the very minimum, this is what you had talking about the previous question here. 2008 R2 64-bit. Everything must be in an Active Directory domain, which is very typical of SharePoint now, or even .NET 4.0, IS7, PowerShell 3.0. If you want to do a load balancer, if you want to have load balance multiple machine farms. And the interesting one here, and we'll see this here in a little while, is that it's a dedicated server. No other applications installed are using 80 or 443. It will not even install itself if it sees something is using. It automatically shuts down the default website, and will not. But if there's something apart from the default website running on there, it will not share. It does not like to share that server. 443 is you can run Office Web Applications in either a non-secure or secure environment, or securely, an SSL cert. But if it detects there's something else there, and it detects there's other applications, it will not install. And I've run into this a couple times. And by that I mean it can't be another you cannot install it on a SharePoint server. You cannot install it on a domain controller. You cannot install it on an Exchange server or a Link server. And I think there's a couple of other ones, but those are usually the big ones that we see. So it's not that Microsoft doesn't recommend it. It's that Microsoft just simply does not let you. There is no way around that. All right. So whenever I'm spinning up my test farms, as opposed to my previous all-in-one Wonder Boxes, now I have at least 3 servers: my AD, my SharePoint, and my Office Web Applications as I'm playing around with it. So something to keep in mind. I will tell you, by default, the dedicated, it wants to use SSL certs. It automatically looks for that SSL for when you first install it. It assumes you're using SSL certs, and it wants to use them. In a test environment or even your own internal environment, you're confident that you don't necessarily need to have it. And I'll show you how to get around that and what special commands you need to do. So you can use port 80. You can use Office Web Applications externally, meaning that if you send someone a link, a file link to, let's say, a file share internally, and they can see that externally, they don't even need to be part of your, logged into your domain, that's when you really want to go secure. And it does have methods of handling non-secure traffic internally and handling external traffic with the security certificate. So it recognizes that, and it works well with it. All right. So let me check to see. How many more questions? No? Am I good? Looks like I'm good. All right. I'm either boring you all to death or I'm not. But now let's jump to the exciting part. Let's jump to the actual demo, and let's see if I crash and burn or I do relatively well. Of course, I'm hoping I do relatively well. So let's start here with I have 2 servers, right? I have my OWA server here, and my SharePoint 2012 server here with some documents. Our typical behavior in our document library is that when we press the ellipses, this is what we get, right? If we click on the link, it wants to download it. Typical behavior if we don't have Office Web Applications. A couple things I will point out. When you have Office Web Applications, the default behavior will change to display these files in the web browser by default. That can be modified per site collection, or via PowerShell or via the GUI. So that particular behavior, so you can force it one way or another. And a really cool thing is that when you click on this, as opposed to this very minimal information, you'll actually get a preview up here. So if everything works correctly, we're going to see a preview of this Word document or the PowerPoint or things of that nature. So let's do that. All right, now first thing we need to do is, it's a very minimal farm. It's just one SharePoint server and one Office Application server for the sake of my sanity here. Now the first thing you want to do, and you talk about, and you'll look, and I'll outline these in my show notes, is that when you're dealing with Server 2012 or Server 2008, there will be different prerequisite installers that you'll need to do manually. Those are, of course, outlined by Microsoft, and of course there are a lot fewer installations or prerequisites when you're doing 2012. I assumed here that most of us are still in the 2008 world, haven't quite made that jump to 2012, so I'll do this on our 2008 R2 server. And I'll outline what exactly those prerequisites are. And basically, it boils down to, you have the service pack, you have PowerShell 3.0, there's one hot fix that you have to put into place, and the third one is, I can't remember off the bat, but I think those are the major ones. There's 4 of them in 2008. So, and of course, now we got our setup file here. It's something we get as an ISO. This is that we can leverage, or you get from your particular company. And I've already expanded it here. So let me look at my notes here. So the first thing we need to do, this is the first command. So in our 2008, we need to install. Now we just can't first go and install their stuff. There's some other prerequisites if you look at the documentation that it talks about you need to install. And this is all very quick PowerShell commands to run, to install the particular components on that particular farm. So let's do that. Let's start with it. Import, we're going to open up PowerShell, because remember, this server does not have anything installed on it as far as SharePoint or anything like that. So we have to, these new out-of-the-box servers, we have to give them some things. Okay, good first step. And let's see how this one runs. And look at this line, should be a couple very obvious things, add Windows features. We want to add the web servers, the web component modules, static content, a lot of web stuff, the ISAPI stuff, web security, Windows authentication, stuff that when you normally install a Windows server is not normally installed as a role, and ink handwriting and ink support. I've gotten a question about that a couple times. Why do you need that? That is for your touch support. So you have tablets that have touch. They need those particular components. So let's go here. Now, of course, you can install all these manually and do it yourself, but much easier, much quicker to run this PowerShell command. And of course, I'll provide those to you. And of course, if you look at the TechNet article, those outline those too. So it's just a simple copy and paste from the TechNet, very beautifully written TechNet article. So I must say, Microsoft did not confuse me this time with their TechNet articles. So while that is running, let's see here. First thing we need to do after it finishes, it installed everything, but it requires ink support and handwriting requires a restart. So let's do that. Restart. Okay. Oh, and this is my appropriately named Acme domain. Now SharePoint 2013 is a great piece of software, but again, if you've looked at the minimum requirements, they are pretty hefty, and there's a reason for it. The odd thing that I've noticed is a coworker noticed that remarked that whenever we see Windows 7 and we see that Windows 7 could run 1 gig of memory, our automatic inclination is to throw more RAM into it. How can Windows 7 possibly run on 1 gig of RAM? It's just not possible. The opposite behavior is true whenever we see SharePoint servers. More often than not, I'll have a customer ask me, oh, do we really need 24 gigs? As opposed to the other direction of, do we want to add more? Do we want to take away? So just kind of one of those odd things that behavior people have that I've noticed, and as my couple of my coworkers noticed as well too. So while we're waiting for that, I did want to show you Google is our friend. So if we do a site search, Microsoft.com. So Office Web App 2013. Using it, deploying it, configuring it, some very well-written articles, and almost all the power, almost all the scripts that I'm using here will be in there as well too. So before you begin, and it breaks it out between Windows 2002, here are the prerequisites I was talking about. Here's the features I was talking about. As you notice here for 2012, basically you're just installing the roles for 2012. There's no prerequisites you have to really install. And as soon as you get through that part, which we're at that part right now, then it just talks about, hey, install it. Now the interesting thing here is there is no key for Office Web Application. The licensing model for Office Web Application in 2013 is that if you want your users to be able to view documents in any one of the programs, they can do that without a license. So if you want your users to view documents in Exchange, Link, or SharePoint, there is no licensing requirement around that. Microsoft does not currently have any licensing requirements around viewing your documents. The key there, though, is if you want your users to edit documents, to be able to create documents, they will need to be licensed with Office Professional Plus software, desktop software, and that license gives you the right to be able to run editing. Now, the scenario here is, let's say you have a company that has Office Professional Plus on their desktops. Everybody's happy, and that means that we can safely create and edit documents within Office Web Applications. But let's say, we wanted to extend that capability to our external users. Well, what we can do is, via some 2013 licensing trickery, is we could say, okay, this group, the external group, can view these documents. They have the ability to open these documents, not edit, but view these documents, and we can do that legally and keeping to the SharePoint licensing model. So really cool thing there that we can do for our external users or our partners or vendors or whatever you use it for, so they don't have to open documents, and it gives you some ability to control whether or not they're downloading it. Now I will say it doesn't give you absolute control. Absolute control means that you want to control absolutely whether or not they have the ability to download it or not. That is left to still the rights management with SharePoint and Microsoft. So if you want that ability, you have to look at the rights management. All right, so I think we have talked enough, or quote unquote stalled, right? So let's see if it's back up. All right, good sign, right? So my tightrope walking over the fire has not burned me yet. So now let's move on to step 3. And basically, that's setup. This is really quick. I agree, continue, whatever specified location you want, install. Thing to note, as with SharePoint, Office Web Application creates its own logs. So if you're having problems with Office Web Applications in particular, it creates its own ULS logs, which you can, during the install, they have some command line parameters of if you want to put the log on a different drive or anything of that nature. I personally have not seen degradation of performance if you keep the logs on the same drive. I'm assuming there probably is, though. I just haven't had any customers quite hit that quite yet or need a different drive for their log files to maximize performance. All right. Usually we're going more in the route of dedicating roles to the servers or something of that nature. And we're done. All right. So the next step here, down here, is now that we have it installed, I think I notice here is inet mgr. A little quick shortcut there. I think we should notice this. I just want to show you this real quickly. Basically, Office Web Application leverages the power of IIS. That's why you load up a whole bunch of modules using IIS. Nothing's here, right? And it's even started. Look at that. But that just means we haven't installed anything. As soon as we install stuff, this will dramatically change. And this is the reason why it doesn't want to share any of this with any other programs. All right. So let's create a new farm. So new Office Web Apps farm. Now there are several switches we have that we can have. We're just going to start with real basic ones. Internal, URL. Oh, I should probably find out. Let me back up here a moment. Oh, look, and I already mistyped it. Maybe I should just copy and paste, right? Hostname. Make sure I get that. And let's make sure. I always, let me copy and paste this, because I'm notorious about fat fingering things. Nope. And this is going to error out, but that's okay. And we already made my first mistake. It is creating a new Office Web Apps farm with an internal URL of this, which is obviously wrong because it should be this. Now, as I mentioned previously, by default, it wants to do HTTPS. So we have to put in a special switch to allow HTTP. By default, it only wants to view documents, not edit. So we have to enable editing, command line switch there too. And it can get somewhat long and complex here when you're creating your farm. But I think one thing we should see here, let's refresh that. Oh, it didn't work, that's why. So, let's copy that. Make that local. All right, a minor gaffe there, so please excuse me. And let's wait for this to run here. While that's running, we'll go back to the TechNet documentation here, basically telling us, hey, licensing, install language packs, avoid language packs. We're going to show you that. We're going to do this scenario, and of course, this is what we're talking about here. We're running this command currently. Gives you a couple, if you have a 3.5, which I really have not seen, even though they say it's a big deal. I have not seen that. So basically what happens, after it creates the farm, we can go and look at the farm to make sure it's running correctly by opening a browser and copying and pasting this. Of course, substituting the server name for the URL of the server there. It should spit out an XML file. And that XML file details what services are running and available on that server. Again, that's part of the language that they all talk to each other and see exactly what does who. Oh. Do I want to do this? Am I sure I want to do this? Yes, I'm sure. So let's give it a second here. Now the speed of which this installs, of course, is dependent on your hardware. So I would not expect to be this fast if you're trying to run this on 2 gigs of RAM. All right, so a couple things to see here. All the parameters we can log in when we're creating a farm. We can specifically denote in our Active Directory organizational unit that only servers that are part of this particular organizational unit can be an official Office Web Application server and be able to join it. If they're not in this particular organization unit that we designate, in this case we didn't, but we can, and then we try to join that a new office, a rogue Office Web Application server, something sitting under somebody's desk, to that, then it will not be part of it. It will not let it join it if it's not in that particular organization unit. Here, as I mentioned earlier, we clarified the internal URL. We have an external URL, allow HTTP, even with true. You can do SSL offloading, the ULS logs. All these things can be modified at the commandlet level of PowerShell. Again, all PowerShell, right? So, and as we add servers here, this machines list will actually grow. So now, let's take a look. Let's go back here, and let's see if it made a liar. Boom. Will you look at that? That actually removed the default website. Okay, so now we have created 2 Office Web Applications, 80 and 809. Or this first one is 80 and 443, right? That's what basically your WAPI hosts interface with to get services, okay? 80 and 443. 809 and 810, respectively, of HTTP and HTTPS are the ports that are used to communicate within the Office Web Application farm. So if you have multiple servers, they need to be able to talk over 809 and 810. So something to keep in mind if you're designating security servers or have real tight restrictions. For Office Web Applications, the only thing you need to talk to them is 80 and 443, and that's all the SharePoint or the hosts need to be able to communicate with. That, of course, there are additional ports that need to be open for Active Directory, logins, blah, 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 blah. But that's all really the WAPI hosts need to be able to communicate with the WAPI app. Okay? So I have a question. I have a couple questions. I'm sorry, I'm just totally. Okay, so let's do the first one. If we want to edit documents in a mobile, will we need to have a license? Yes. You will need to have a license. You'll need to have a license somewhere. If you're working for a company and your work computer has the appropriate Office software, then gives you the license to be able to edit the document on a tablet, even if it's not an, oh my God, not a Surface tablet, which many of us don't have Surface tablets quite yet. You know, if you, let's say an iPad, I've worked with it on an iPad, and it's worked really, really nicely. So yes, it's a licensing requirement. Next question, what are the advantages of having Office web apps when compared to accessing documents on a desktop? That is an interesting question. I will say that if you have the full power of the fat clients, the clients that actually sit on your Office desktop, there is no real advantage to using Office web applications from the desktop perspective. But again, in a company like mine where I work at, we have half of our houses are on Macs. Half of our houses, you know, our salespeople use Macs, so they don't necessarily have Office web applications, or it doesn't work as seamlessly with Windows machines. Or, you know, our Linux friends don't have, will obviously not have Office unless they're running some kind of Wine or something of that nature. So that would be the real big thing, you know, for those people to add functionality to those people. But if you're a pure Windows user and you hate everything else, and you don't know why people would ever use anything apart from Windows and the actually very nice Office 2013 suite, then there's no real advantage to it. Okay. All right. So, and everybody's excited that I'm doing this so well, right? Now that we have created it, let us go and see if it's working as we expected. So the IIS sites are there. Now we're going to test it to make sure we get back the response that we expect. So I'm going to copy and paste here to avoid any fat fingering, of which I have more than enough. Paste. And it's not there. And we also need to type in hosting. And of course, my magical fat finger ability already. Discovery. Ah. Did I type it in wrong? Hosting discovery. Not a good sign. But let us move beyond that. I'll assume that it is working for now. If not, we can go back and look at it. Typically, what you're supposed to get is something like this. Basically, it's an XML view, and I'll have to find out why. I bet you anything I have loopback disabled. The loopback enabled on this machine, which will require a registry check, a registry edit or something of that nature to get it off, which require a little bit more time than we have. Usually that's the problem I see when this happens, is that the loopback check has not been disabled. And if you're not familiar with the loopback check, there was a previous, just quickly, there was a previous hack that went around and basically allowed hackers to I'm not really quite sure, basically access the website by looking back at itself. Kind of a weird way of doing things, but Microsoft's fix for that was saying, oh, okay, you can't do that at all. Of course, services like this, where you're trying to test stuff, you're going to need to be able to do that. So usually it's just a real quick registry edit. And there are technical articles around explaining why and what, and whether or not you should enable it. So let's keep on moving. Probably something I forgot to do when I was installing it. But now that we have Office web applications installed, we have a new set of commandlets that we get access to. So we have a bunch of gets. Here is the command we use to create the farm. Here's the command we use to add a host to an existing farm. Oh, I'm sorry, it's this one. Remove a host, remove a machine, remove the farm, change certain parameters within the farm, change certain parameters on the machine. An example of the machine changing parameters on the machine would be to make it a dedicated Excel web app. Okay, so just a couple of those you get access to. Again, realizing that these commandlets are only available on the Office Web Application server. They are not available on your SharePoint server. All right. So now we've completed our modifications of the. Now we have an hopefully operational Office Web Application form. So now let's switch over to our SharePoint server. So now we have to tell our SharePoint server, hey, there is, and we have to do this in the SharePoint management shell, so we have access to all the SharePoint commandlets, or if you do it out of the main SharePoint thing, you'll have to manually add in the SharePoint module. Now that we load it up, paste it, good. All right, I did not fat finger that one. But basically, if we look at this command, it's, hey, there's a new SharePoint WAPI. We need to create a new SharePoint WAPI binding. This is basically telling SharePoint, hey, look, go look over here at this server over here, and we want to allow HTTP. Again, but by default, it wants to do HTTPS, right? And we'll see that. Let me get the name one more time. A common mistake that a lot of people do is they think when it sees server name, they want to put it in HTTP. No, you just put in the server. I have a typical habit of using fully qualified domain names, FQDNs. Basically, the host name dot the domain dot the suffix, just out of habit, and it seems to work best for me. So now we create the binding. Bam, it looks like it's working, right? Basically, it tells you, oh, I created this binding. I see the Office Web Application farm, and here's all the documents that can be serviced by the Office Web Application farm. We see the various Word files. What's your Word files here? Keep on going. More Word, more Word. I probably didn't go, but there's also Excel and PowerPoint and all the various Office Web Application farms in here. So basically, the application is Word. The extension is default action false, the server name, and the zone, right? We set up that zone previously in this command right here. Now let's talk about the zone. You must start messing around with zones when you create these. Because on the Office Web Application server, we set up this one internal zone. Now that SharePoint connects to it, it's only going to be able to leverage that power within the internal zone. So if you extend a website and you want it will not work with the external users from that website, because Office Web Application is only right now currently configured to work with the internal zone. So if unless your external people can somehow resolve SP 2013 javi-sp2.acme.local on the internet, highly unlikely, then it will not work, right? So let's get the zone. Let's see what's happening. Now, like I talked about earlier, this is something important. Internal-HTTPS. Now, this is not a mistake. Again, this is SharePoint wants to use HTTPS behavior. And we're double checking it to make sure, even though we have set up everything, we've used every flag to use HTTP, it still wants to use HTTPS. It just does not want to use anything else. But we can change that, right? Next command. So we want to set it WAPI zone. Again, copy and paste is our friend. And set the WAPI zone internal HTTP. Right? So now if we look at the, now it's set to internal HTTP. So far so good, right? Believe it or not, we're almost nearing the end of this. A couple things to note if you want to use HTTP, even after doing all this, it still will not work, believe it or not. And we can see this by this particular PowerShell command, which again isn't, I'll put in the notes, but it is in that same, this second part of this document. By default, get security token config, allow auth over HTTP, false. Even though we've configured it, told it it's HTTP, it still will not work. There are components within SharePoint that want to use HTTPS. It is false. So we're going to have to modify that. If you're doing this within a production farm, this is only really affects Office Web Applications. I've not yet seen it affect any other part of it, so these modifications don't really affect anything else apart from Office Web Applications. So now we're running this particular PowerShell command where we want to set the flag to true. Right? That's, oops, what did I do? I skipped a step, didn't I? Allow over HTTP. Allow OAuth over HTTP. Oh, I did, and I forgot to copy and paste something. Let us go find that particular command because my memory is not what at best it should be. So the second part of this article, it's a good opportunity to show you this, is how to configure SharePoint 2013 to use Office Web Applications. So now it talks about what steps we're taking, copy and paste, copy and paste, copy and paste, set the zone. And look, where it says right here, to use 2013 over HTTP test environment, you must allow allow OAuth over H to true. It will not work unless we take this up. And here's the thing I forgot to get right here. This particular command where we create the variable. So now paste that, because you would be spending a lot more time just watching me type, and that is not very interesting. Although you can make fun of me while you're typing, my poor typemanship skills. Now we set it to true, but that's in memory. It's not written to it, so now we update it. Cool. So now it is updated. Now we can validate that by coming back here. We'll get the value, and it is now set to true. All right. So now at this point, everything should be ready. Everything, that's all the steps we need to do. Let me see. Okay, I had a question come in. Does the multi-tenant AKA managed by you version include OWA? Okay, I can take this a couple different ways. Multi-tenant meaning that if you set up a multi-tenant in SharePoint farm on-premise, on your own premise, can that use OWA? Yes, it can. Now, if you're asking, does the multi-tenant of my company version include OWA? No, it does not. The multi-tenant managed by my particular company is hosted SharePoint. Unfortunately, it still is at version 2007. And at version 2007, Office Web Applications did not exist. There is a concerted effort to change that. I can say and get it up to date for our users of that particular level. I hope that answered that question. So, coming back here, home stretch. Now, we're either going to see a bedazzling display or a fiery death. So, let's try this first. Oh. It might need, well, that's a good sign, believe it or not. Oh, oh, oh. I am biting my nails in anticipation. No. So, that is going to require some troubleshooting. Let's do this first, though. Let us close this browser. Now reopen it. Sometimes just a swift kick was enough to get it working. Documents library. Oh, all right. So it's probably something that same problem that originated from the XML file. But at this point, that'll require some troubleshooting, which is beyond a little bit of scope here. But what I can tell you is that here's how I would proceed. Basically, the first thing that I would do is I would go and look at the ULS logs of the SharePoint server. Typically, the ULS logs of the SharePoint server can give you the most, tell you exactly what's going on. They're fairly straightforward as far as Office Web Applications are concerned. Usually a jumble and a mess everywhere else, but usually pretty straightforward from there. Additionally, you can look, if you scroll down here to the bottom of this article, it gives you some troubleshooting steps as well too. Microsoft anticipates you're going to be having problems with it, and so they already put in, these are the common things that go wrong. Let's see, verify the app's working. Problem, these are the most common ones you'll see. Something went wrong. Sorry, we can't open this document. What did I get? Oops. Oh, there it is. We can't open this document. If you set up test environment, you make sure you have true, which I did that. At some point, you can have domains allowing list. Okay, that might be something we need to look at because we can definitely limit the allow list of which SharePoint servers are capable of using that particular host. So the thing to keep in mind here is that, and the reason why we have this particular command is that multiple SharePoint farms can use a single Office Web Application farm. Multiple Exchange installations, for example, can do that as well too. A lot less likely to have a multiple Exchange farm. More likely, you're going to have multiple SharePoint farms for particular reasons, and they can use a single Office Web Application farm. And you can create the security and definitions around that using this particular commandlet Office Web App Host. So busy, try again later, file not found, content cannot be displayed in the frame. These are the most common ones, and I of course hit the most common ones, and so I can go hunt down that particular problem. One other common one that they don't have listed here, but that I do see, is that if the new Office Web Applications sometimes does not play well with the previous versions of Office file formats. So I have seen some DOCs, like ancient DOCs, not work It's kind of surprising. I thought it would work, but I've seen some of those not work. That's usually the problem. I'll have the person simply, resave it in an updated format, 97 at least, and usually that solves the problem. So let's see here. All right, let me check my questions. Enterprise hosting. Well, let us check that one, shall we? A question about our particular hosting service. So let me answer that one. Take a look at that. Oh, okay. This is actually, I still believe, part of our 97 farm. We do have a separate offering right now for a 45-day trial that is based off of SharePoint 2013, but that is purely a demo farm. But yes, that demo farm does have Office Web Applications installed. So a couple different solutions that are available to you. Just to keep in mind, that's just the SharePoint, the way SharePoint is. No one customer uses SharePoint the same exact way as the next customer. It's highly unlikely, and that's just the way SharePoint works and is. And, it's a very interesting field to be in. All right, so see where we're at. Make sure we have no other questions. Well, that should wrap it up. Like I said, if you have any questions, please feel free to, let me get that back up here, email me, hit me up on Twitter, or just go to my website, or however, whatever preferred method you have. I will be posting up this deck on the website, and I will be troubleshooting this so you can see what the resolution of that was. So exactly what went wrong. I'll lay it out there in a format and follow up with it and go a little bit more in depth as to what the fix was for this particular problem. So while not playing with fire, not a total crash and burn, like my pessimist side would expect, it was fairly straightforward. We got it up and running. It was probably a little minor problem. All the little minor problems show up there, unless it's perfectly set up. The one thing to keep in mind, like I mentioned earlier, if a typical user sees this problem, they see this, and then they see this, they're going to tell you there's just something wrong with SharePoint. Stuff you want to keep in mind. So we know it's not SharePoint. It's actually a different application that's causing the problem. But to them, they don't grab the particular nuances of that. So to them, that's representative of a major problem within SharePoint. Probably not. Probably a minor fix. And again, by the portable nature of Office Web Applications, I can totally remove this Office Web Application feature set, and it will not disrupt SharePoint at all. Basically, if I remove the binding, if I have to go as far as creating a whole new Office Web Application, if I have to remove the binding, SharePoint suffers no downtime. And the only thing that really changes here is when I click on the document, the default behavior of downloading a document or opening a document in your FAT client works. And the preview that we have here now just isn't there. Apart from that, no disruption to the SharePoint farm. Just some minor changes, but nothing at all. And that's the great thing about this new version one of the great things about this new version of Office Web Applications. So, there are no other questions. I think that will wrap it up. Please, any stone throwing, criticisms, please let me know. I'd be happy to hear that. Can do nothing but help inspire me, and hopefully get my next time get my demo working correctly. Compliments, please let me know that too. I have a big ego, like to be fed. But in the meantime, I do various SharePoint Saturdays. I encourage you to visit your local SharePoint Saturday if you have one coming up this year. I'll usually go out and present it multiple times at SharePoint Saturdays, so please feel free to say hi, come see some of my sessions, usually a little bit more technically orientated because I'm an administrator, and please feel free to come and say hi. If not, thanks for coming out. Y'all have a good day.